Yes, it's 100% real. Real medieval knights could do backflips, cartwheels, and full sprints because custom armor only weighed 50 pounds and was perfectly distributed across the body. But if Hollywood and popular video games lied to you about full-plate armor, what else did they fake? Here are the top 5 medical and anatomical myths you still believe about the Middle Ages. Myth number 1. The dead at 30 illusion. Pop culture loves to tell you that the medieval human body decayed at warp speed and that blowing out your 30th birthday candles meant you were a wrinkly, geriatric ancestor ready for the grave. If you look at standard historical data, the statistical average life expectancy back then really does sit around 30 to 35 years. However, this is just a classic case of bad math and a complete misunderstanding of data. The reality is that high infant mortality rates drag the entire mathematical average straight down into the gutter. In the medieval world, surviving infancy and early childhood was the real Hunger Games. Infectious diseases, lack of modern pediatric care, and childhood ailments meant a massive chunk of the population never made it past age 5. But if a medieval person actually survived childhood and reached their early 20s, their body was remarkably resilient. Barring a sudden war or a run-in with a major pandemic like the Black Death, a standard adult easily lived into their 60s and 70s. Historical records show 13th century English nobles who reached age 21 actually had an expected lifespan that stretched well into their mid-60s. Old age isn't a modern invention. We just got way better at keeping babies alive. Imagine walking through a medieval village expecting to see nothing but teenagers running the world, only to find a bunch of gray-haired elders yelling at people to get off their farmland. The human body hasn't structurally evolved that much in 1,000 years. Wrinkles, joint pain, and gray hair happened at the exact same pace back then as they do now. So, the next time you see a movie where a 35-year-old is portrayed as a fragile, dying ancient relic, remember that real medieval adults were living long, full lives, probably complaining about the exact same back pain you feel after sitting at your desk for too long. Myth number 2. The rotten teeth fallacy. If you watch any historical drama, every peasant is depicted with a mouth full of completely rotten, black teeth. It makes sense on the surface because they didn't have electric toothbrushes, fluoride, or modern dental plans. You would think their mouths were absolute biological disaster zones. However, archaeological excavations of medieval cemeteries tell a completely different story. Real physical evidence reveals that medieval peasants actually had significantly healthier teeth and fewer cavities than the average modern human sitting in a dentist's waiting room today. The secret to their perfect dental health boils down to one major factor: the complete absence of refined sugar. Pure sugar cane was an incredibly rare, hyper-expensive luxury item reserved strictly for royalty and the ultra-wealthy. The average peasant survived on a staple diet of coarse whole grains, stone-ground vegetables, and calcium-rich dairy foods. Studies show only about 20% of excavated medieval teeth show signs of decay, whereas modern populations heavily saturated with high-fructose corn syrup and processed snacks face drastically worse rates. While medieval people didn't have modern toothpaste, they weren't walking around with zero oral hygiene. They regularly cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with linen cloths and chewing on fresh herbs like sage, rosemary, or mint to freshen their breath. They even used primitive toothbrushes made from frayed twigs to scrape away food particles. The only major downside to medieval dental health was physical wear and tear. Because their bread was made from flour ground on stone mills, it contained a high amount of grit and stone dust. Chewing this dense, gritty bread over a lifetime physically ground their enamel down like sandpaper. So, while their teeth might have been heavily worn down, they were shockingly white, clean, and completely free of the rampant decay we see today. Myth number 3. The forever filthy body. There is a massive cultural myth that medieval humans never bathed, actively feared water, and spent their entire lives caked in layers of mud and filth. We imagine a world that smelled entirely like a dumpster fire, where people went from the cradle to the grave without a single splash of water hitting their skin. This entire concept is a total historical fabrication. In reality, medieval Europeans deeply valued personal cleanliness and took personal hygiene incredibly seriously. Public bathhouses were massive social and recreational hubs spread across every major city in Europe. For instance, 13th century Paris boasted over 30 public bathing establishments, while London and other major hubs had dozens of hot steam baths available for the general public. These bathhouses weren't just places to scrub down. They were social spots where people met up, ate food, and relaxed, much like modern saunas or spas. Even for the poorest peasants who couldn't afford city bathhouses, washing was a daily ritual. Citizens strictly washed their hands and faces every single morning using water basins and clean linen towels. Hand washing before and after meals was an absolute social necessity because people frequently ate with their hands from shared platters. Furthermore, medieval people used soap on a regular basis. Soap makers' guilds were thriving across Europe by the 7th century, creating various soaps from animal fats, wood ash, and soda. The wealthy even imported high-end olive oil soaps, like Castile soap, infused with beautiful floral fragrances. They also wore linen undergarments specifically designed to absorb body sweat and oils. While outer wool clothing was difficult to clean, these linen underclothes were washed constantly by professional washerwomen. The myth of the entirely dirty human actually stems from the later Renaissance and Victorian eras, when fears of syphilis closed down public bathhouses and led to a temporary decline in bathing. The medieval crowd, however, loved a good, clean scrub. Myth number 4. The savage butcher doctors. When we think of medieval medicine, we picture a terrifying horror movie where a chaotic barber surgeon knows absolutely zero human anatomy, screams wildly, and blindly hacks off limbs with a rusty saw while the patient just prays for a quick end. While it's true they didn't have modern anesthesia or X-ray machines, medieval battlefield doctors and surgeons were shockingly sophisticated, highly analytical, and remarkably successful at keeping people alive through complex trauma. Take a look at complex brain surgeries like trepanation, the literal drilling or scraping of a clean hole directly into the human skull to relieve intracranial pressure from head trauma. Archaeological evidence of recovered skulls shows that medieval surgeons performed this highly delicate operation with extreme precision. Shockingly, the survival rates for these ancient skull surgeries were upwards of 70%, with clear signs of bone healing around the surgical cuts. Surgeons also possessed an intricate understanding of how to treat deep battlefield wounds. They famously treated severe iron arrowhead injuries using specialized, custom-invented mechanical extractors designed to carefully expand and pull out metal shards without tearing major arteries. Most impressively, medieval doctors accidentally figured out the foundational principles of antiseptic medicine long before anyone discovered germ theory. They recognized that wound infections and sepsis were the leading killers in surgery. To combat this, they heavily utilized wine and honey as topical washes. Wine contains natural alcohol that acted as a highly effective, scientifically proven antiseptic that sterilized surgical equipment and cleansed open wounds. Honey contains natural antibacterial properties that actively smothered bacteria and kept wounds clean. They might not have known what a bacterium looked like under a microscope, but their highly practical, battle-tested methods saved thousands of lives on a daily basis. Myth number 5. The genetic giant myth. The final myth centers around the physical build of the elite warrior class. Because we see massive, looming suits of armor in museums and read epic fantasy novels, we've built up this idea that medieval knights were physically massive giants, towering, broad-shouldered superhuman monsters who looked down upon ordinary, stunted, malnourished peasants. We assume that 1,000 years of human history means we must be twice the size of our ancestors. The hard science of bioarchaeological skeletal remains completely shatters this illusion. The skeletal remains of actual medieval knights and soldiers show that the average height of an elite warrior was only about 5 feet 7 inches. They weren't towering basketball players. They were almost the exact same height as the average European or American man throughout history. What made a knight terrifying on the battlefield wasn't their vertical height. It was their hyperdense muscle mass and lifelong physical conditioning. Knights were essentially professional Olympic-level athletes who trained in heavy physical combat from early childhood. Wearing custom-fitted, perfectly balanced plate armor required immense core strength, agility, and cardiovascular endurance. Their bones show distinct, thickened markers where heavy muscle tissue anchored to the skeleton, revealing bodies packed with dense, functional muscle from a lifetime of sword swinging, wrestling, horse riding, and intense military drilling. They didn't need to be 7 feet tall to be lethal. Their speed, extreme conditioning, and specialized gear made them absolute tanks on the battlefield. They were normal-sized humans who simply trained like absolute beasts. Subscribe.